We're going to hear from Dr. Nick Skowronski from the USDA Forest Service Northern Research Station. Nick can give a more formal introduction to himself and his background and why he's excited about this workshop series. Then we'll hear from Dr. Kevin Hiers from the Tall Timbers Research Station, and we'll hear a little bit more about Kevin and about why he's excited for this series. So without further ado, Nick, take it away.
Okay, good afternoon, everybody, if it's afternoon. So I'm Nick Skowronski. I'm a research forester with the U.S. Forest Service Northern Research Station. Excuse me. And I guess my background's been kind of varied. I started out as a land manager after graduating from on my undergrad experience at Fort Dix in New Jersey. So I spent a good bit of time there working as the prescribed burn coordinator and doing actual land management for the early portion of my career. It's kind of relevant in what we're talking about today. So I've sort of seen both sides of the coin, if we want to consider it that. I mean, we want to kind of move towards maybe there not being a coin at all and maybe just sort of being sort of boundary spanners on both sides of that coin. Eventually I went back to graduate school, and I've been focused sort of in fire ecology, terrestrial, carbon cycling, nutrient cycling. I'm a remote sensor by trade, so I do a lot of like active remote sensing work with LiDAR, looking at fire severity, forest structural changes and things of that nature. So I really sort of focused my career on tying sort of cutting edge science back to land management. And so it's always been kind of interesting to me to sort of look at that interaction between those sort of two sides of that coin. And so we're really briefly going to today just sort of introduce some ideas for this workshop. Again, we're really kind of bummed out not to be doing this in person, but we're going to try to do this maybe a little bit differently than just talking at the screen and interacting a little bit. We're hopeful that that'll work. And so I just want to sort of point out that this workshop is sponsored by the Fire Science Exchange mostly. I mean, that's NAFSE is the group that's sort of putting this on, but there was a lot of support from the U.S. Forest Service Pacific Northwest Station and also the Northern Research Station. Tall Timbers in Tallahassee, Florida, has put a lot of effort into this and funding as well. And in this situation, we have a lot of support from our partners at the New Jersey Forest Fire Service. And they've always been very supportive of our science, and I'm going to use them sort of as an example as we go through. Also, the Forest Stewards Guild and the Northeast Forest Fire Protection Compact are sort of how we make NAFSE work. So I just want to make sure that we acknowledge all those folks right now. Okay, so the question is sort of why are we here? What's the objective of this workshop from our perspective? And I'm sure that everybody has heard the buzzword now that the sort of national policy of the Forest Service, or national sort of how we want to move is to increase the pace and scale of prescribed burning. It's like the biggest cliche in the world at this point. But it's a noble goal, and probably something that everybody on this call sort of understands and supports. Basically, how can we burn more? How can we burn more intelligently? And how can we burn more effectively? That's sort of the goal of this workshop, is to try to facilitate that in the Northeast a little bit more. So to do that, we have these objectives of raising awareness of prescribed fire as a tool, empowering the participants of this conference to use modern scientific tools that will help them to implement prescribed burns back on your home unit. We wanted to probably a little bit more, if we had been in person, to inform decision makers, sort of local politicians and maybe some national politicians as well, about what we're doing, and have them have sort of a shared experience with us as we went through this workshop. And then we also want to sort of showcase some examples of where we think that this is working, where prescribed fire is working, where science is being integrated into prescribed fire. So those are the objectives of this workshop. So I just want to kind of introduce this idea of prescribed fire science as like an overarching theme of what I'm going to talk about and what Kevin is going to talk about today. And it's kind of, I want to say it's sort of nomenclature. You might argue that all fire science is fire science and that there's not really a need to differentiate prescribed fire science. But Kevin actually led a paper earlier this year that came out in Fire Ecology, and sort of discussing the reason why we're interested in science to support prescribed fire itself, generally, basic science focused on prescribed fire, as opposed to taking science that was developed in the realm of wildland fire. And so I really think that this sort of this graph here on the lower right of this slide sort of really illustrates the point. Where wildfires occur, and where prescribed fires occur. You know, basically we're not burning in wildfire conditions for the most part. And so that we've been focusing on those conditions, and we need to maybe look at some more marginal conditions and things of that nature. So this is a really good outline and a really good paper to sort of support what the main idea here today is. Okay, so I think one of the other sort of overarching sort of ideas is that maybe in the past, science has been sort of in this ivory tower. And I think that there's been some consternation and some non-integration between scientists and managers in the past because of this attitude that regular scientists are sort of in this little ivory tower, and that a lot of the work that we're doing and that we spend time on, that sort of cutting edge research, doesn't get seen and it doesn't apply. No one can understand it, and so it doesn't get used, right? I mean, I think that everybody would sort of agree that there's that fringe out there of theoretical science that is just not really applicable. It's interesting, it's really cool, but it never really gets translated into management hands. And so I think that one of the things that we want to do is sort of change that paradigm moving forward. And I think that we've made a really strong effort to do that and have done that. And it's been happening in the past. This isn't new. But I think I want to kind of like, for the management side, maybe help you to understand why that ivory tower exists. And I'm sure a lot of you have kind of seen this figure before, this idea that this is like sort of all the knowledge in the universe in this top left-hand corner of this, that as your education goes along and progresses, you start to know a little bit more and a little bit more about it. And that really all a PhD does is makes you the expert in one little tiny ray reaching out from the middle there. And so you are the expert, and your job as a PhD is to push that boundary, but really maybe have lost a bit of perspective, right? And when I think about sort of all the things that a land manager has to do, from budgeting to staffing to keeping track of weather to fire behavior, fire ecology, you know, they're more of one of these sort of central ideas, or sort of in the middle, where they have to have a vast knowledge of a lot of things. And so I think it becomes a little bit of a translation issue when somebody that's an expert in, say, remote sensing like me tries to interface and provide my views on why my remote sensing research is so important, when the reality is, you know, COVID-19 is hitting and we're looking at furloughs or something like that, and that's what the land manager is dealing with. And so I think that there's a real big sort of just built-in mismatch between the training of a scientist and the training a manager has gone through. So I want to talk real briefly about the research cycle, right? Everybody is probably familiar with this. So how do we do research, or how do we fund research, probably is more important. But it's this sort of cyclical design that never ends, right? We identify a research idea, we design the study, we do the research, we analyze the results, we publish the research. Hopefully we get money to do more, and then we start all over again. Okay, and in this, it's sort of that ivory tower idea again, where we want to kind of avoid having it be just the scientist involved in this process. And so how do we get around that? Well, there's this idea of co-production, and it basically co-creates the knowledge to inform decision-making. And there's several characteristics that you can read on the slide there that make co-production a more favorable way of performing science, especially in our case, okay? And so this was a NAFSE, probably one of our sensing sessions, probably 6 or 7 years ago, where we were asking our stakeholders, what do you want to see from the Fire Science Exchange? And those kind of activities could really help from the research aspect as well. So what does that do, right? This is basically this idea that managers and scientists are working together to frame the discussion, to carry out the research, to present the results, and define the application. And what does that do, though, right? Not only does it end up having research implication, not only do we have better research that's more topical and more applied to the things that we're looking at, but it also helps to increase like the learning opportunities that are available for the land management agency. It makes the scientists more prone to understand what they're looking for, be on target more with their science, and it makes it so that the science is more likely to actually be used, right? And when it comes down to it, this decision-making process is what we're really trying to impact. And so working together in this situation just basically creates a huge educational opportunity that leads to increased outcomes and all of those things. So how does this happen? And the first is this idea of communication and trust, working down to sharing success. The Fire Science Exchange networks are really good, sort of at these top two and this bottom one. And the two there, sharing opportunities and limitations and practical limitation or implications, that's really sort of a science and management conversation, right? The exchanges can really help with the bracketed issues, but the scientists and managers have to work together on those other two. So if we could adapt this research cycle, it would look more like this, right? Where the managers are working the whole way through, designing the study, helping to carry out the research, analyzing the results, publishing and giving talks on things. So we're sort of working towards this type of model. And as a really good example, in the Pine Barrens, when the National Fire Plan was implemented in 2001, there were several stakeholders that sort of came together and said that they wanted to support a research program in the New Jersey Pine Barrens. And this was basically this fresh start. Science had been sort of out, fire science had been devoid in the Pine Barrens. Probably for about 20 years, there wasn't much going on. So it was a real fresh start with new people. And several of these people came together and started this sort of grow a web. They had a shared vision and they all worked together. And at the beginning of this collaboration, we would go and say sample post-fire vegetation or pre-fire vegetation. So our access was sort of limited to like, well, we did burn over here, you should go check that out. And then as we sort of went along and gained trust, we were able to show that we belonged there. We provided good and adequate products for land managers, right? So one of the first things we did was to fill an immediate need for land managers by providing fire weather data in the system, being trust that way with our stakeholders. Several of us in that program, really were active in the fire service. We became known quantities and resources for fire suppression or for prescribed burning opportunities, and so we sort of integrated that way. As time sort of went on in this example, we started to move from the point where we were sort of scientists on one end until we were sort of integrated into the fire service in New Jersey, where we were making presentations, we're having discussions, we were doing that sort of first cycle of the research where we were designing research projects and showing how it fit. And as time went on, it moved from us basically having access to prescribed fire or to us doing post-fire ecology to dictating what it is that we wanted to study, right? What are the things that we wanted to look at, what the state wanted to look at in partnership, and allowed us to do some very innovative things through the years. As time went on, we were able to work together and obtain a lot of funding to do a lot of things that really had very real impact to land managers. Looking at canopy bulk density in 3 dimensions at one point, looking at the effectiveness of fuel treatments and firebrand generation, doing sort of active crown fire experiments at one point, safely burning into a pre-burned area. These experiments attracted interest from across the world. The students in the lower right there, from basically most of those folks in that photo are actually from Scotland. They make the trip to the Pine Barrens through the year. It's like fireflies coming to the area. Okay, so as time went on, we did more and more of these innovative type experiments, and it allowed us to attract other scientists, to attract partnerships for funding agencies, and to have specific management questions that we were able to answer as time went on. So what's needed for that? There needs to be recognition and incentivization to make these kinds of things work. The New Jersey Forest Fire Service example allowed us to work together and really fostered us. And there was a reward system there. We played off of each other. We were both getting something out of it. And we also need to have organizations that promote the communications between those stakeholders. So I want to sort of show how we're moving forward with this at sort of a national scale. And Kevin's going to take over here and keep on trucking with it. So Amanda, I'm going to stop sharing.
I'm here.
Okay, there you go, Kevin.
All right, Kevin is up. Thank you, Nick. And I didn't see any questions in the chat box, but if you do have any questions, feel free to type them in. Kevin, go ahead and share your screen whenever you're ready, and we'll keep rocking and rolling on. Thanks.
Okay, let's see if we can get this rolling here. Amanda, can you see my screen there?
I can. Let's put it in the presenter view.
Yep. All right, here we go. So Nick ended with this slide that really describes how we've been approaching this process at Coproduction, and I feel like it's a concept that we all intuitively know and think about and try to practice, but putting a term to it like coproduction or boundary spanning is actually pretty important for doing it well. A few years ago, Nick and me and a couple others from the U.S. Forest Service around the country, including some folks on this call, Matt Dickinson and others, Los Alamos National Lab, came together with a series of managers with this idea that we needed a Prescribed Fire Science Consortium to really fundamentally advance the discipline and the tool suite available to managers to expand that pace and scale of prescribed fire. And so we created a national Prescribed Fire Science Consortium of the willing partners. There's no, bylaws, there's no organizational structure. It's that we come together and we talk about this stuff. And for a little while, that's kind of what we did. And there are a few elements of co-production that have to be present for any effort to be successful. And I'm going to dive into how this Prescribed Fire Science Consortium has led to a successful model and how we're hoping to expand it in New Jersey and throughout the Northeast and Great Lakes a little bit later. But there's three elements that have to be met if managers and researchers are going to co-produce knowledge. And the first is credibility. You have to have credibility with members of the team. The second is salience. Your information has to be, relevant to the processes and the problems at hand. And then you have to have legitimacy. You have to have standing in the community in order to bring that information up and deploy new technologies, models, or what have you. And the way that we really started pursuing this process was, kind of coming together around a basic idea that 21st century landscapes that we now manage, and here are some of the fires that I used to conduct down at England Air Force Base as their prescribed fire program manager and later the fire management officer before I got into research. We need 21st century tools to help managers accomplish their objectives in that increasing complexity in those landscapes. And so the Prescribed Fire Science Consortium, again, just word of mouth, grew exceptionally fast to really achieve a national relevance. We started bringing together partners around the country, managers and researchers, and then ultimately grabbed some opportunities overseas as well to share experience. And so at the core of Wildland Fire is the fact that experience is the bridge between what we know in theory, research, structured learning, and what we know in practice, that experiential learning that we get as managers. And so for the credibility, we felt like shared experiences coming together and setting fire were going to be the foundation of this Prescribed Fire Science Consortium and the foundation of our model for co-production. What it also allowed us to do is when we weren't setting fire, we had that informal downtime where small groups could form and have conversations about, what was bugging them or what they saw as strategic opportunities or new tools and technologies down the road. But what this also gave us was a safe place for young managers to kind of get a research, exposure, but also young researchers to interact with senior managers. And when I was moving one time, I had a realtor that produced a got a guy, got a gal list. If you needed a plumber, it was on this list. And that's essentially what we created through these informal relationships for younger researchers and managers, is that they could call up somebody and ask a question, or if they formed that bond, they could form a place to create knowledge together on a particular landscape. But this research burn event as the foundation of co-production for us in the Prescribed Fire Science Consortium really allowed for a lot of creative space that involved demonstrating next generation technologies, whether they be drones, modeling, infrared cameras. But what the power, and we didn't really fully expect this at the time, but the power came from this bottom up manager research consortium and collaboration that led the folks up top to know that we wanted what we wanted and that they needed to get behind and support it with funding. And so this bottom up participation really in leadership really has led to a lot of success, a lot of credibility and legitimacy when we go to those funding agencies that want to really focus on expanding the patient scale of prescribed fire. So here are a couple of details about the burn events. We started in tall timbers, bringing folks together. We've had as many as 90 people on a particular fire. Most of those fires were small in scale. They had research objectives, but we let the managers lead, and we always had conversation. In 2018, we had the opportunity of expanding that model to Missoula, Montana, associated with the Continuum conference out there. And I think we were the only fire set in the state that day. We had an international audience observing with more than 75 people that had come from the conference to participate in conversations around the fire line. And we had more than 40 people on the fire line itself, both conducting the burn and research for the event. One of the participants was from Australia, the Center of Excellence for Prescribed Fire. And she actually led or helped us expand this concept, at least through a webinar, to Australia, where they had not really thought about this full and total integration of science and management together. And so we've been able to at least demonstrate our model to an international audience, as well as hold a funding source workshop for the Joint Fire Science Program in Salt Lake City of last fall. And of course, this is part of our next Prescribed Fire Science burn event series, although we're going to have a virtual burn event, obviously, that we've been discussing both today and then coming up in September. So what has come from this collaboration, and what's management relevant? Well, for a long time, we've had the ability to use supercomputer models to look at coupled fire atmospheric behavior processes. Those are the processes that govern nearly every aspect of prescribed fire implementation. We set multiple fire lines. We use backing fire, flanking fire to control risk and risk of escape along the edges. And these supercomputer models have been around for 20 years. Nick works with a similar model, Ruddy Mel up at the U.S. Forest Service in the Pacific Northwest Fire Sciences Lab. This one is called FireTech from Los Alamos National Lab. It models prescribed fire and winds at a 1 to 2 meter resolution, where you can actually get a sense of updrafts shown in red and downdrafts shown in blue, and how they might relate to your choice of ignition pattern, spotting distance, smoke transport, etc. And yet we've been limited by our lack of creativity in applying these supercomputer models. Imagine you as a manager, if you had a physicist in your hip pocket and say, hey, Rod Lynn or Ruddy Mel, what if? And that's what has partially come out of this, is we've been much more creative about how to use something that has to run on a high-performing computing bank at Los Alamos. How do we make that management relevant? But one of the real, I think, powerful things has been the support of a faster-running suite of tools that are supposed to capture these coupled fire atmospheric interactions. And QuickFire is such a tool that has been developed by the consortium and has been tested and being tested by the consortium in a variety of landscapes. QuickFire is sort of the A- solution of the full physics model, runs on a laptop in near real time, and is capable of capturing real ignition patterns as it produces smoke and disperses that, and is fast enough to be able to run ensembles of prescription. Are there thresholds of fire behavior that you expect in certain systems? This is a model of QuickFire. Nick Skowronski has worked with the modeling team to look at reconstructing fast-moving wildfires in the New Jersey Pine Barrens. This is an initial reconstruction of Spring Hill wildfire using QuickFire, and subtle oscillations in the wind field side to side create the crown streets that you see in the initial fire run. And you can see that we're actually capturing many of those in the model simulations there. So QuickFire is a prescribed fire science tool that we're trying to get in the hands of managers in a variety of ways. But like I said, we're limited only by our creativity for using the full physics model. And working with the Prescribed Fire Training Center out of Tallahassee, Florida, we've begun to think about these supercomputer models as the foundation for virtual reality training. It'd be the first time that burn bosses have essentially a flight simulator for prescribed fire, where we can test real ignition patterns that are produced by a physics model that's responsible for those fire line interactions that we saw on a previous slide, and be able to pipe them into an Oculus Rift headset and let people walk through the fire or take different positions on the fire. Ultimately, we see this as sort of the future of training, where we can make this process interactive once we have quick fire able to respond to your changes in ignition pattern. And maybe Nick and I are walking through with 2 drip torches. And so that, again, this has all emerged from these dynamic conversations between managers and scientists. Of course, to apply next generation fire behavior modeling tools, you have to have next generation fuels. And we've typically, over the last 40 years, oversimplified forests and variation, homogenized it, two-dimensionalized it, and think of it as just blocks on the landscape rather than real variation that drives management outcomes. And so one of the strengths of Nick's research group in New Jersey is their commitment to LiDAR technology. And they're currently, as part of the consortium, one of these outgrowths, developing a next generation monitoring protocol using a small low-cost laser with the Southeast Regional Office of U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service is actually paying for Nick and Tall Timbers to help them develop these three-dimensional monitoring technologies and tools so that they can then commit to being one of the first user groups for quick fire or other similar coupled fire atmospheric behavior modeling tools that are going to be commercially and operationally available. And so just to kind of leave you with the opportunity here, as we move to the Northeast, we know we need more fire, not less. And that to expand those prescribed fire treatments is going to require some regional innovation, and managers and researchers in those regions are going to be best suited to take advantage of how to creatively apply modeling tools and techniques, whether it be for smoke dispersion or fire behavior. But we feel like this has got an opportunity to really fundamentally change the game for confidence, either in communicating what we think is going to happen to the public around a prescribed fire, or if you're going to be burning a new area, to be able to give you some confidence that we've got bounded error for fire behavior that we expect. I can't overemphasize the importance of having this bottom-up partnership where we have fire managers and scientists saying the same thing about what they need, and they've come to that consensus together through this experiential learning opportunity. And that bottom-up role for these kinds of events has created a lot of power to communicate and to advocate to folks with funding to make these things a reality. And that shared experience really has been an amazing bridge to expand and accelerate the application and relevance of prescribed fire science to management. And so here we are, and I'm about to hand over the microphone to Virginia, but we're at a point where Nick and I started with New Jersey Forest Fire Service and Greg McLaughlin back in that 2018 Missoula event. They said we're going to host one in New Jersey. It's going to be in 2020, and we had everything in line, and then we've been COVID, but we're not going to let that stop us, and we're going to do this anyway. And we're going to try to highlight some of the things that we can show you over the computer and think about this creative applications process, co-production process as a virtual workshop.